everyone. It is Jamarl Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. I hope everyone is doing okay this evening. We're starting off with a late show. We have a few shows that are going to take place tonight. So let's get down to doing the news. I was reading through several show ideas earlier today, and I was having a hard time figuring out what I wanted to do, but I think I have a few set of stories that I think are interesting, not just to me, but to my audience. The first one is the one that's probably the most overriding and pressing thing. I guess that is on all of the airwaves, and at the very least it should be somewhat important to us. The governmental shutdown. The government is still shut down, and apparently this is going to be one of the longest shutdowns in government history, if not the longest. And there is no signs of this coming to any level of resolution. Nancy Pelosi has said that we have no incentive in order to change our position on this, and the only thing that we've heard is to essentially stand strong. Seeing that Democrats are usually wet noodles on stuff like this, I suspect that what Nancy Pelosi is saying is true. All the incentives for the Democratic Party is not to budge one iota on this. In fact, the incentives are for them to stand firm because their party, at least the members of their party, don't want them contributing not $1 to an unnecessary border wall. Independents are not on board for him giving money to this border wall. And while he has his base, the people who put him in office, you can say maybe 20-30% of the population that is on board for this, there is a dwindling level of people who become on board for this at the expense of shutting down the government. From a politics standpoint, he loses on this. That said, the politics of this as an overarching thing is a little bit different than the politics that he's dealing with. He made a campaign promise in order to build a wall. He staked a lot of political reputation on getting that wall built. And in this big political fight, the question becomes, does he have the ability to do this? The Senate, the Republicans in the Senate, Mitch McConnell specifically, has essentially stood by the president and has not allowed any bills to come up without the president's approval on, which means that even if you had a contingent within the Senate that will give a simple majority to opening up the government, Mitch McConnell has refused to allow this to take place, seeing as the president can, I would imagine, veto it if it doesn't necessarily include a border wall. I guess Mitch McConnell say, why bother if the president's going to veto it? This assumes that there's not a supermajority in the Senate. It's just to override the president's veto. So that's where we are. We have a Democratic Party that has no incentive in order to change their policy on this, and we have a Republican Party that's standing by their president. Some are peeling away, but for the most part, you have a standoff. A standoff that is no incentive or no, there's nothing to give any kind of heads up that this is going to end anytime soon. So this goes into the weekend with Congress essentially going to their corners for this weekend. So two things. Trump has declared that there was going to be a national emergency, or he could declare a national emergency in order to get the funding for the wall built. He's backed away from that today. In fact, let me show the video of him, you could say, throwing cold water on that, or backing away from potentially doing, where is it? Or him potentially doing the national emergency. Now, understand, all of this is purely for a political campaign promise. It's not because it's something that's required. It's not because there's emergency at the border. None of that stuff is true. This is him creating a national emergency in order to fulfill a campaign promise. That's all it is. You have nearly 1 million people who are not getting paid, who this Friday, 800,000 workers who didn't get paid their money because Donald Trump wants to put up a border wall that's entirely unnecessary in order to fulfill a campaign promise. So the national emergency was his way out. It was his end around Congress. He wanted to try to find ways to fund that border wall without going through a Congress that wasn't going to give him the money to fund that border wall. The national emergency was his magical door that he was looking for. He's backing away from that magical door. I want to explain why. The second thing I want to bring up is, does he have the authorization as President of the United States to declare the national emergency, and will it stick? So two things. Trump backs away, and why? And does he have the authority to declare the national emergency? So here is Trump essentially moonwalking away from the national emergency thing. If this video is lagging, I'll put up the original video afterwards. I mean, my local version of it. All right, let's hear him out.
One of the big problems we have is our border, our southern border. And we're going to take care of it. Now, the easy solution is for me to call a national emergency. I could do that very quickly. I have the absolute right to do it. But I'm not going to do it so fast because this is something Congress should do. And we're waiting for the Democrats to vote. They should come back and vote. A lot of things are working out well, but the southern border is something that should be easy.
He's waiting on Democrats. It would be easy to declare a national emergency. If it would have been that easy to declare a national emergency, Donald Trump would have did it. The reason why he's not doing it, even though he may be forced to do it later, is because he's getting pushback from Republicans. Like, of course, Democrats are going to be against it, but the Republican Party itself is pushing back on this notion of the president going around Congress. Whatever you want to think of Republicans, they don't necessarily want to cede power to the executive branch in this way. So I'm going to show two Republicans' responses on this. So one is Grassley. Oh, here's another thing. There's more people who are in the country legally from overstaying their visas. If I'm not mistaken, twice as many people are in the country from overstaying their visas as opposed to coming across the border. The amount of people who came in from illegal immigration has gone down year by year by year over the past decade. This is made up. He's making this up whole cloth. Right here. So Grassley, I think the president should not do it, Charles Grassley, independent Republican in Iowa, told reporters Friday. I think as a member of Congress, I ought to be selfish about the constitutional powers that we have to appropriate money. I think it may be a bad precedent. Regardless of what they want to think about Trump, they don't want to undermine their own, let's say, powers per se. They cede a ton of powers away from the standpoint of war. They don't necessarily want to cede them from the standpoint of the purse strings. He's not the only one. Marco Rubio comes out. Where is this coming? The Florida public contended that Trump was elected on the promise of building a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border and that the president has to keep that promise. But we have to be careful about endorsing broad uses of executive powers, he added. I am not prepared to endorse that right now. Such a declaration would set a precedent, Rubio said. If the national emergency is a border security, tomorrow the national emergency might be climate change. And he's right, by the way. Imagine the next president coming in and saying, we have a national emergency for climate change and we need to allocate funding for XYZ. We have a national emergency for a healthcare crisis. We need to allocate money for XYZ. You can imagine what this goes. Hell, maybe the next president shuts down the border because they're paying Medicare for all. Shuts down the government because they weren't paying Medicare for all. Understand the precedent that this sets. And some of these Republicans are aware that the next president may be a Democrat, and the next president may start declaring similar stuff. Right. And by the way, this is something that not just these two Republicans, there have been apparently whispers about this within the Republican Party, and his issue with this is that this splits the Republican Party. That's his issue. The reason why Trump is backing away from this is not because he's grown a conscience or anything like that. It's more so, I'm splitting my own party. If I go this route, I need to go this route first. Fact of the matter is, though, he may be pushed into this regardless. Marco Rubio is right on both fronts. Trump needs to build this border wall because he staked so much political capital on building this border wall. Even though it may split the party, he may be forced into a situation where he has to go the national security route because at this point, he staked his political capital on building this wall. And even if he creates a huppapaloo within the party, even if he splits his party, even if it's not entirely legal, but he creates this thing where he can start getting it done, it, from the standpoint of his base, looks as if he fought vigorously and went to the mat in order to get this wall built, and he succeeded in doing it, even if it gets legally challenged and even if it potentially gets rolled back in the next administration. At the very least, he can get across, I did this. It looks worse if he just loses outright. Meaning, the national security thing may be something he needs to do regardless. He keeps asserting, I have the right to do this for national security, I have the right to do this for national security. The fact of the matter is, he may be right. And not just he may be right, whether he's right or wrong, it may be necessary for him to go that route from a political standpoint. You can't stake this much political capital where you're shutting the government down in order to get something accomplished and then lose. That's a worse outcome. It is a better outcome, even though the outcome doesn't necessarily look all that great, to go to the mat for it, including I am using national security powers in order to accommodate or pull money from XYZ in order to get this accomplished. Regardless of what he's saying, apparently he has been eyeing various sources on how to fund the government through disaster relief funding. Right here. And then we're going to get into whether or not it's legal or not. The Trump administration is considering using billions in unspent disaster relief earmarked for areas such as hurricane-pounded Puerto Rico and Texas. That's gross. That's gross. Puerto Rico was completely destroyed by this. And instead of us living up to our obligations, we don't want Puerto Rico to be a state by the same token as a military position. It is an amazing military position. But we don't want to live up our obligations to that when it got destroyed. If Puerto Rico was, let's say, Florida or Texas or somewhere, we would have diverted all the necessary funding in order to make Puerto Rico whole again and not use this kind of disaster capitalism in order to take advantage of the fact that Puerto Rico was destroyed. But in this case, looking to Puerto Rico and Texas to pay for Donald Trump's border wall as he weighs in signing a national emergency declaration to get the wall built without Congress. This is why congressional Republicans have turned around and said, I don't know about this. The White House has directed the Army Corps of Engineers to comb through its budget, including $13.9 billion in emergency funds that Congress earmarked last year, to see if the money could be diverted to the wall as part of a declaration. That's according to the congressional aide and administration officials familiar with the matter who spoke on condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to speak publicly. Let's be clear with this. When stuff like this comes up and they say it's an anonymous source because they weren't allowed to speak publicly, oftentimes it is aspects of the administration that is trying to float an idea. They are unclear on how the public is going to accept it, on how the Washington establishment is going to accept it, so they float it. As opposed to him just doing it, they float it. What are the people going to say about it? What are the people going to do about it? How are the people going to organize against it? Are they going to be okay with it? And how much opposition are we going to get to if we just go through and do it? Not to mention getting people acclimated to the idea of it before you actually just go through and do it. It's easing your way in as opposed to just ramming your way in. That sounds nasty, but it gets across my point. So the second part to this is whether or not it's illegal for him to do. It's one thing for him to decide to do it. It's another thing about the legalities of it. Two things. Because it's going to sound like I'm saying two things because I've been critical of the wall. What is moral and what is legal are two very different things. Locking up a stoner who is, for all intents and purposes, a perfectly nice and okay person, but because that person smokes pot, you put that person in prison. That is perfectly legal. Whether it's moral or not is a completely separate issue. The drug war was started because Nixon wanted to castigate or to create a division in what he thought were political blocks between blacks and hippies. And this was his way of going about doing it. We have locked up stoners over the course of the last 30, 40, 50, 60 years, ruining their lives for what ended up being just a political stunt. Now, that said, is it legal? Yes. Is it moral? Absolutely not. Tax cuts for the wealthy, while at the same token having people sleep on the streets. Perfectly legal. Is it moral? That's a different question, or whether or not it's okay for a society to allow people to sleep on the street or go without having their basic needs met. Allowing cops to take property without any kind of crimes being committed. The anti-BDS movement, where Congress has gone through to essentially castigate speech with regards to a perfectly nonviolent way of trying to deal with abuses and crimes committed by the Israeli government. Now, it's apparently, they're trying to criminalize calling out the fact that they're treating people miserably and immoral and illegal behavior by the government, while the same token making it illegal to call that out. Same thing with animal agriculture. You're treating animals in horrendous ways, while the same token the illegal part of it is showing it. Same thing with military. I mean, you can go through the list of these. I guess my point is there is a difference between legality versus morality. And the second point, Back during, I think it was the 1960s, John F. Kennedy castigated and chastised Dwight Eisenhower, saying that Eisenhower was complacent and allowing the Soviet Union to essentially create a missile gap. And making this argument of a missile gap, essentially the media picks this up and everything else, and they go with this idea that there is a missile gap between the United States and the Soviet Union as Eisenhower's fought, and that the military needed more funds and all this other stuff. This was, of course, a lie. There was no missile gap between the Soviet Union and the United States, and if there was one, it was with the United States having a superiority in the technology and the number of missiles that were at our disposal. You can go the same thing with, what was the other one? There's another one. I can't think of the other one. There was several that I had in my head. But another one dealing with this. This is similar, where the President of the United States comes out and says there's a crisis at the border, that crisis need our attention, and we may even need to declare a national emergency. The fact of the matter is the number of immigrants that have come into the country illegally has gone down over the course of the decade. There is twice as many that overstay their visas as opposed to come in illegally. And Donald Trump is using this for political gamesmanship in the same way that Kennedy was using the missile gap for political gamesmanship. They're similar in this regard. There's a different question of whether or not it's legal for him to do so. The Republican Party has screamed that there was voter fraud and used this in order to institute laws in the various states to try to clamp down on a number of people who are voting that are not in politically advantageous demographics. Now, the reality of this is that there was no voter fraud. And in being no voter fraud, that didn't necessarily stop them from putting through legislation in order to prevent certain majorities that they didn't necessarily like going to the polls because it adversely affect them. What a politician uses for political expedience is different than the actual legalities and good faith of dealing with legal statutes. Whether this is voter fraud, whether this is a missile gap, or whether this is Donald Trump screaming at the top of his lungs about a crisis that doesn't exist at the border, all of these things to some degree are the same. Politicians, for political expedience, not acting in good faith in order to, let's say, pass some kind of political legislation or in order to effect some kind of political will. This is no different. The truth of the matter is that the president, at the president's discretion, can call a national emergency. What Congress can do to stop it is to override it with the House and the Senate voting to override it in the same way that they could, let's say, override something like a presidential veto. They don't have these numbers, which means that the president could call a national emergency. There are certain laws that constrain the president's ability within the context of this national emergency, but the president would have to cobble together and explain what laws he's using in order to make this work. But he may be able to use a grab bag of laws in order to make this work, in which case it may be perfectly legal, even though grossly immoral, for the president to call a national emergency for something like this. This is going way overboard on time. Vox has done a really, what I think is a decent article on this, going into the legalities of this. Fact of the matter is, Donald Trump can call it. Donald Trump can come up with a grab bag legislation. Good faith of it doesn't matter. Whether or not there's a crisis at the border doesn't matter. He's the president of the United States, and he can do it. They will take him to court over this. The president has put 2 people on the Supreme Court, and depending on Ruth Ginsburg's medical health, may end up putting 3 people on the Supreme Court. But either way, there's an overarching majority of conservatives on the Supreme Court, which means that this may fly. This may fly. My point is, the reality of it doesn't matter. Reality and legalities are 2 very different things. Morality and legalities are 2 very different things. Just like there was no missile gap, just like there is no voter fraud, just like there is no issue with border per se, it doesn't necessarily stop the people in political positions for asserting something in bad faith for political expedience to get them from point A to point B. Donald Trump is essentially following an ignoble tradition of other political leaders in order to get things accomplished out of political expedience. That's my point. Yes, he can do it. Yes, he can find some grab bag of laws in order to cobble together in order to try to make it work. Yes, he may be able to pull funding from other sources. Yes, it is also true that this may be grossly illegal, but this is somewhat of a gray area it is also true that he could be taken to court over this, but at this point, he would have already started instituting the procedures necessary in order for those fundings to be pulled away. No, organizations are not going to ignore what the president is saying. That sets a horrible precedent. And they're going to go through with the procedures. Whether those procedures end up being illegal or not, it will be for a court to decide whether or not it stops what the president is doing. So that's... there's a ton of articles at the bottom of this because it took a bit of reading to go through it. And I'll go through a few of what people are saying on this. So Trump did not declare a national emergency when he addressed the nation, but he keeps saying, I have the absolute right to declare an emergency. He said, I haven't done it yet. I may do it if it doesn't work out. I probably will do it. I will almost definitely say definitely. That is a weird way of speaking. I'm not going to do this. I have the ability to do this. I may do this. I will probably absolutely do this. Which one is it? which one is it? You may do it, you will do it, or you absolutely would do it. You've said all of it within the same statement. It's a weird way of talking. He has a broad leeway to declare an emergency, frankly, whether one exists or not, said Elizabeth Goten, co-director of the Liberty National Security Program in the Brennan Center for Justice, who recently wrote an in-depth explainer of the presidential emergency powers in the Atlantic. The idea of invoking emergency powers is indicative of how much discussion over the government shutdown have broken down. Trump is so hell-bent on his wall, it seems almost as if there is no length he won't go to get it. There's something admirable about that, even though what he's doing this for is utterly deplorable. But there's something to be said about willing to go to the mat. In recent history, he's talking about other presidents, they've done so under the National Emergencies Act of 1976, which lets presidents issue an emergency declaration under certain constraints. Namely, Trump can only use certain power Congress has codified by law, but he has to say which powers he's using. The 1976 law was actually passed to rein in presidential power and codify how presidents were going about declaring emergencies, from Franklin Delano Roosevelt to Richard Nixon. It offers no definition for what counts as an emergency, meaning it's open-ended to some degree. If Trump were to try to get border wall funding through the National Emergencies Act, the question becomes which existing laws could he use to get the money? That's where he and legal scholars tried to figure out what he's talking about, running into trouble, identifying the laws and statutes he could actually use. The Brennan Center for Justice tracks about 130 laws that contain special powers the President Trump could access. And at this point, it gets to pre-existing laws. He, for example, could reallocate military spending on construction projects for the wall. And this is essentially what they say he's eyeing, or what NPR is saying. President asks sources for the one new wall as it declares a national emergency. I'm not going to go through each and every bit of this because this video has gone over 20 minutes. But you get his point. Let's see. Dear Jamarl, please read my comment before Jay Scott's. I don't believe in his version of meritocracy, but on the other hand, I have $5 to spend, so, oh, that's funny. I gotta be honest, I don't often read Jay Scott's comment because he's just a troll, and I tend to ignore trolls. So, there's that. Let's see. But your comment has been read, so. Trump can take $100 billion from the military and spend it on the wall, then add $100 billion to his next budget. Look, the president has broad powers on this. I think this wall is utterly nonsense. But whether I think this wall is nonsense or not is secondary to whether or not the president has the authority to go through with it. The fact of the matter is, he's the president of the United States. And a president hell-bent on get something accomplished, you'd be surprised on how resourceful the president and the powers that have been accrued in the office to get something accomplished. When Obama came through and said he was going to close Guantanamo, God, I wish he would have had the same stones and balls to go through with what Trump is doing in order to do it. Meaning, you're going to the mat for something. And even though what he's going to the mat for is utterly absurd, it would be nice, and there's something admirable about a president willing to do something like this. Just not for this reason. I mean, this reason just seems ridiculous. Seems ridiculous. Best spent $5 for trolling ever spent. That's funny. Jamal, what do you think is going to happen with the IRS? That the government may need to pass a bipartisan bill. Well, that depends on whether or not Mitch McConnell is going to do it. Mitch McConnell has essentially stood back saying, I'm not passing anything if the president is not going to support it. For the time being, Mitch McConnell is staying stuck on that position. I don't know if this is a safe position for McConnell or not. I think the position is safe for Democrats. Yes, I don't know if it's necessarily safe for McConnell. It may be safe just because all of the heat on this is going to Donald Trump, meaning everybody blames Trump for this, not necessarily the other Republicans, even though it is the Republican Party that is standing in alignment with Trump in order to make this work. But McConnell has said hands are off until the president goes through with it. So I don't know. If we had a real emergency, we'd be pissed if Congress tied his hands. If we had a real emergency, yes. If we had a real emergency, yes. And people got mad at me for calling Jay Scott a troll one day. Jeremy Chase, well, I mean, it depends. But at this point, he is a troll. I mean, he's gotten mad about the Sam Cedar stuff, and at that point, he's just trolled. So I tend to ignore him. Hey Jamal, response stream title. I don't think it's illegal, but I do find the national emergency and humanitarian crisis language irritating as a civilian. Yes, I do. It's aggravating. What was going on in Puerto Rico was a national emergency. The homeless crisis, I would argue, is somewhat of a national emergency. I don't think anybody should be sleeping on the street. The idea that they gave us 12 years left as a proclamation from the standpoint of scientists saying you have 12 years left, you need to get your house in order. That's a global emergency. None of those things get the resources that they need. They kneecapped the Green New Deal, even among the Democratic Party, even though that's a party that says they believe in science. So, it's like screaming at the top of your lungs that a national emergency is at the border, and it is clear that there is no national emergency at the border, that this is made out of whole cloth. Yeah, that's somewhat aggravating to me. It's aggravating. If American men needed 100 million hard-ons, Trump could buy... What? James PFP. So on the flip side, Trump isn't making things worse by getting one of his platform points accomplished inside of 4 years. Look, I think I've said before, I don't care if Trump builds the wall. I don't care if money is allocated to building the wall. By the same token, Democrats shouldn't give him a dime for it. And they shouldn't give him, one red penny for going to this nonsense wall. If that means that Trump is going to shut the government down over it, the Democrats are perfectly safe in their position of, we're not giving them a red dime. If you want to build your wall. You said Mexico is going to pay for it. That position, I think, is relatively solid from the standpoint of Democrats. You told the public that Mexico was going to pay for the wall. Let Mexico pay for the wall. Because, this is your own campaign promise. Fact of the matter is Mexico's not going to pay for it, so now you're trying to get the American public to pay for a wall that's unnecessary, creating a crisis that doesn't exist. So their position is relatively solid. Trump's position, I think, is more shaky. I think at a certain point, I've said before, I think those federal workers that are working and not getting paid should stop working. If the government is going to be shut down, let the government be shut down. It needs to hurt. The more that it hurts, the more pressure that it puts on the political apparatus to fix it, which means that it puts more pressure on Donald Trump to resolve this issue. One or two things is going to happen. Either he's going to build a wall or not. There's no middle ground, which means that there's a clear political standoff between Donald Trump and the Democratic Party. Between the two, it was Donald Trump that ran around saying he was going to build a wall. It is Donald Trump's responsibility to build that wall. Again, whether we need it or not is kind of secondary to the responsibility that he's had based on what he told his donors that he was going to build a wall. So fine, build your wall. But you can't necessarily expect the other party to help you in building an unnecessary wall for a crisis that doesn't exist. He's in a weaker position, at least based on my political calculus. I think he's in a weaker position. Here is 5 more from Cryptic Warrior. He would have donated himself, but Trump's cock holster payoffs aren't paying the bills like they used to. Bernie or Guillotine, thank you. Cryptic Warrior, thank you. Here's $5 more from Cryptic Warrior. He would have donated himself, but Trump's cock holster payoffs aren't paying the bills like they are used to. Oh, that's funny. That's funny. Ireland, it's the same corruption, but the media is hijacked by billionaires and politicians who are bought off. Let's see. Cryptic Warrior. Wow, laugh my ass off. That is fucking funny. Baltazar makes me not want to post. Why does Baltazar make you not want to post? What is Baltazar saying? Chucky the Shoon will pay for it 1.6 billion at a time as long as Israel gets its full support. Oh, here's the thing, Baltazar. Israel is already getting Chuck Schumer's full support. Already. It doesn't matter what Trump does. Schumer is already on board for anything that takes place in regards to Israel. It's almost treasonous. You can make an argument for it. Cheryl Brandon, Schumer should deduct the money from the Israel $38 billion welfare. There you go. There you go. The $38 billion welfare. Israel are a bunch of welfare queens. Rob Lenoyes, Trump to a major political L. It's time for him to shut the fuck up and keep moving. He's never going to... I mean, Rob, let's be honest. You and I both, and a lot of lefties, wish that Obama had the stones to go to the mat for something like this. You and I would have loved for Obama to do that. Now, not for something ridiculous, no, but for something that the public was interested in, that was to the public's benefit. This wall doesn't fit that, and so it makes it look utterly absurd. There are things that a president can push for that are in the best interest of the country, that the public itself would be for, that an intractable Congress may be against, where the president may pitch a bitch in this way and create a political standoff. It's one thing if the public is backing you with this political standoff, it makes your position more politically sound. In Trump's case, there is no crisis at the border. The crisis at the border is one that he dredged up for political expedience, and right now, he doesn't have both branches of government in order to pass this wall. He said Mexico was going to pay for the wall when he knew Mexico wasn't going to pay for the wall. He essentially lied. And now he's in a political sticking point where he's put all of this political capital on trying to get this wall built with a party that has told him, kick rocks. Not just kick rocks, but our base, and when we look at the polls, the public is telling you to kick rocks. Here's the catch. Donald Trump may get points on immigration from the public, meaning the American population may look at something that he's saying of rhetoric and say, okay, yeah, maybe we need to do something at the border. Because in their mind, they don't believe a politician will flagrantly lie in the way that he lies. So they say, okay, maybe there's something that needs to take place at the border. It is a secondary thing of him building the wall. Building the wall was a campaign promise that they looked at as him making a campaign promise. But they're not necessarily on board for him shutting the government down in order to fulfill that campaign promise. Those are two very different things. The public may not even care whether or not he all that builds that wall, but they will care if he's shutting the government down in order to build a wall. He is in a politically weaker position. By the same token, it is worse if he comes away from this with nothing, which means he's not leaving this alone. Like, my point is, Rob, he's not going to shut the fuck up and walk away on this, because that will be a politically worse position for him to do. He is floating this thing of a national emergency. Some of the Republicans are against him declaring a national emergency, but between him declaring a national emergency and catching flack from the party, his own party, in doing this, versus him walking away with nothing, it is possible that declaring a national emergency is the best outcome out of a situation where he's already losing. It's like, if I'm going to lose a rook and a knight, I'd rather lose the knight as opposed to walking away without any concessions at all. I think it's the same thing. He may be in a losing position where he's going to lose something out the deal, but he wants to get something out of it as opposed to losing it all. So, I agree with you. Shut the fuck up and walk away. You have a million people who are hurting because of some political campaign promise that you're trying to fulfill. But I have a hard time believing that he's going to do that. I think he's going to go to the mat. If Obama shut the government down for Medicare for all, then yes, I would support it. But for a wall, you're nuts. That's an absolute waste of public money. Yes, Rob, I agree. Agreed. Luca Clemente, build a wall around Bibi. Bibi may be going to jail Like, the Israeli thing. So Bibi Netanyahu in Israel, there's apparently a case that's against Bibi for some kind of political corruption that he was engaged in. Bibi may be getting prosecuted. INS seemed to be doing immigration just fine before 2002. Yes, the INS was doing immigration fine before 2002. But from our standpoint, as human beings, we have this weird thing that just because something exists, we believe that it has a right to exist. So people would say, well, wait a minute, ICE was in existence, and miss the point that ICE hadn't always been in existence, that the INS was essentially doing that job, and that they were doing that job just fine. But people don't look at it that way. Sometimes they think that just because something exists, that the existence itself is reason for it to continue existing. That is not true at all. That is not true at all. Yes, shut the fuck up and walk away. And yes, I agree with the government shutdown for healthcare for all. Yeah, like this is kind of my point. If as lefties, there's something about this where we admire, but by the same token, the reasoning for it is obscene. If the president of the United States looked at the public and they say, let's say 70% of the public was on board for Medicare for all. And that president says, look, we have X number of people dying each year because they can't get access to medication, because they can't get access to health care, or get access where they don't necessarily have this crippling bill. People who engage or who need some kind of health care for some kind of major medical treatment suffer a massive loss in the percentage of income. I think it was like 30%, some insane loss after the medical thing as opposed to before it. We have a medical emergency in this country, and we need to deal with this medical emergency. Even with Obamacare, you still have 20 million people without health care. Not to mention, I think it was like 25% or 20% of people couldn't get their prescriptions filled because they couldn't afford it. We have a medical emergency that needs to be accomplished or needs to be fixed, and I am not signing on to any piece of legislation until Democrats and Republicans put the bill before me that essentially deals with this issue. Lefties would be for this. The Democratic Party would be for this. I don't know how many independents. I don't know how many Republicans. But there's something different than making an argument that's based on, I am doing this for the American public, and the public can see and acknowledge that you're doing it for the public. The Yellow Vest movement has 70% approval rating in France. Even after the overwhelming majority of the public was against them burning shit down or setting shit on fire or damaging cars, 80% of the public was against the violence. And in spite of the violence, 70% of the people supported the Yellow Vest movement. I guess I'm making a difference between a policy that the public is on board for and a president that is governing in a populist way in the benefit of the public for whatever he's standing strong on versus this. This was lunacy. This was utter lunacy. Medical emergency, climate emergency, corporate control, Congress emergency, but what about Bezos getting a divorce? Oh, did you see that Bezos was cheating on his wife? Oh, one of my subscribers, what is his name? I can't think of his name. One of my subscribers sent me a thing showing that that Jeff Bezos was cheating on his wife. I was like, what? What? Bezos cheating on his wife? Huh. BB, do you love me? Are you writing the UN for more concessions? BB, do you love me? Balthazar, BB, do you love me? Or they insult him by giving him $1 each. Who are you talking about? President Evo Morales just passed Medicare for all in Bolivia. I think you're trying to say Bolivia. He has been in power for 8 years and he lifted 3 million out of poverty. That's there's something about that should be, if I am in power and I am, let's say, president or something like that, the amount of money that Wall Street is getting is not my benchmark for success. The amount of money that the stock market is getting, again, is not my benchmark for success. 80% of only like 20% or like a small percentage of people own the overwhelming majority of the stocks. So the stock market going up is not indicative of success of the nation. It's only indicative of a small class of people who could afford to donate to the stock market. If I can get rid of homelessness, that's an accomplishment. Like, if I can lift X number of people out of poverty, if there's more money in the wages that people are making, those are the things that I consider to be measures of success. If I can create worker co-ops and create a sector of the society that is not based purely on some capitalist or some business owner as an individual being of a particular class, maximizing his profit at the expense of workers, meaning in a worker co-op having people essentially share the responsibility of creating a company. That's success to me. The lifting 3 million people out of poverty would be an amazing measure of success. That's an amazing, amazing measure of success. But Bolivia is not as rich as the United States, but he wanted this for his people. Did it by decree. Yes. Do you realize that many of these places have started doing food banks? I was downstairs with my mom yesterday, and we were watching. She watches the local news, and even here in Richmond, they started opening food banks in order to deal with people who don't necessarily have or aren't getting paychecks, and essentially can't put food on the table. I understand some Trump supporters are okay with this and backing him, but I suspect you're for this because you're not one of those people not getting a paycheck. Like, there's something disturbing about the support for this. Like, honestly, like be honest. There's no crisis at the border. Be honest. This has everything to do with President Donald Trump wanting to implement something that he said during the campaign trail. Be honest. This is being done for political expedience. Heft all of that, which is absolutely true, against hundreds of thousands of people not getting a wage. Heft that against most people working paycheck to paycheck and barely making ends meet as it is, and then not getting paid. Not getting paid because of, some noble thing that's taken place, but getting paid purely out of political expedience of him wanting to build an unnecessary wall. That is gross. That's gross. You can't blame Democrats for something that Donald Trump has said that he himself wanted to do. Not to mention, he told me that Mexico's paying for it. If Mexico was paying for it, I would shut the fuck up and I'd walk away. Mexico's not paying for it. Just saying. No. Well, okay. Yes or no? So, Max. Alright, 2 things. Bob Ramirez. Jamarl is playing his violin for the donors who can't get their spending bills passed. No! What are you talking about? No. A, what donors am I playing the violin for? I mean, come on, Bob. Be honest. Be honest. Be honest. Be honest. Right now, Bob. Right now. I don't know what your finances are, Bob. But shit, my computer's freezing. But most people, the overwhelming majority of the population, don't have $500 in the bank. Meaning, if they had an emergency expense that cost $500, 60% of the population wouldn't be able to pay it. That's America. Now, within the context of that, because that's absolutely true, that the majority of the country don't have $500 in the bank, meaning if there's an emergency expense that takes place, they couldn't afford to pay it. You have nearly 1 million people, human beings, just like you, just like me, that breathe air, drink water, put their pants on one leg at a time, use the toilet, all those things, those base and euphoric things that it is to be a human being, not having access to their needs, nor being in a situation where there's savings in order to assist them in the gap between that time, between they start getting a paycheck again versus them not getting one. And this wasn't done through any fault of their own. It wasn't because they're bad people. It wasn't because, they kicked their dogs or beat their kids, even though they may do both of those things or may not do either of those things. This is purely because of a president who wanted to get a campaign pledge passed. That's what we're talking about. Whatever else that's there that surrounds this, let's be honest, and what I just said is perfectly true. There are people who are experiencing pain and distress, not for anything that they did wrong, but purely because the president wants to get an unnecessary wall built. Is there a crisis at the border? No. Did Donald Trump make a campaign pledge and say Mexico was going to build it? Yes. Is Mexico going to pay for it? No. Are the Democrats wrong for saying we're not going to pay for your wall? No, they're not. Especially since there's no crisis at the border. And this was his own campaign pledge. No, they're not wrong at all for saying we're not going to give you money for something that's entirely unnecessary. And going back to the workers thing, we in this country have saw a class war taking place against the workers in this country. This class war has been taking place over the last 50 years or so, even though nobody likes to declare the fact that there's a class war because people feel iffy about saying it. That said, it hasn't necessarily stopped their wages from not going up while simultaneously having bills and expenses go through the roof. There are medical, like for instance, medical care. You have prescription drugs that can be doubled. And it's being doubled not because, people did anything wrong, not because the cost of the drug went up, but purely because they're being good capitalists and they know they can essentially hold people over a barrel while they extract a pound of flesh out of them, because nobody's going to say no to the cancer drug that they may need in order to deal with the issue of the fact they have cancer. Like, this is the shit that we've allowed to go through. Now, to that population that's been that hit and struck over the past 40, 50 years, where their wages haven't gone up, where you have a minimum wage of $7 an hour, and from a federal standpoint, to them, to that ameliorated class, to them, you've now instituted a situation where the president, because of political gamesmanship, has decided he's not going to fund the government. Whatever you want to say about me on this, everything that I've just said here is true. Which means there are individuals and people in this country just like you and just like me that decided to work for the federal government, and in working for the federal government are being punished because of what a president is doing, and is being extraordinarily cavalier about the fact that people are not getting paid, that they're not making their ends meet. Food banks are opening up in the various countries or the various states in order to deal with the fact that people don't have food. Now, your comment to me is, essentially disparaging me for pointing this out. Jamarl is playing a violin for the donors who can't get their spending bill. No, I am playing a violin for the millions of people who don't have the ability to get food because they live from paycheck to paycheck in a society that is perfectly okay with allowing their wages to suffer or go down while bills go up, and with a president that is being extraordinarily cavalier about the fact that they're not getting a paycheck. My violin is for the people who aren't able to eat, who aren't able to pay their rent, who aren't able to take care of their kids, who aren't able to pay their car note, who aren't able to access the things that they need. Be honest. Be honest. Like, I understand this support for Trump and all because Democrats are horrible. Granted. But both of those things can be true. Democrats can be lefty in Republican areas because they, but they're not going to live up to those things in reality. It is true that, it is the Democratic Party that has allowed the Republican Party that moved so far to the right. It is the Democratic Party that to some degree is responsible for Donald Trump getting elected in the first place. All of that's true. All of that's true. But it is simultaneously true that a Trump president has made the decision to allow people to go without getting access to the things that they need for political expedience. Both are true. Be honest. Hey Jamarl, does the fact that medical costs are so high in the United States, does that affect how effective Medicare for all will if it passes? So yes and no. The medical cost being high in the United States will have an effect on whether Medicare for all passes, but in the opposite way than I think the question is being asked. Because there is such profit to be made in the medical industry, the medical industry is going to be against any passage of Medicare for all. You must understand, Medicare for all will cut their wages, meaning cut the amount of money that they can essentially harvest off of people's illness, foibles, fuck-ups, breaks, cancers, AIDS, diseases, and all that other stuff. The ability to extract money from people who are in desperate situation goes down. You can imagine that if the money that they can extract from people is going to go down, they're going to be against any legislation that would allow their money to go down. They're good capitalists, after all. From the standpoint of a capitalist, you're undermining our ability to harvest money off of people's vulnerabilities, their physical vulnerabilities. Now, from an individual standpoint, and from the overwhelming majority of us, good. I don't want you to be able to harvest money off of some family member that has some kind of disease. I don't want that. So, from our standpoint, from the 99%, good. from the class of people that harvest money and get profit off of the vulnerabilities of human beings. That is not good. The interests, in this case, are not united. Our interests are somewhat divided between what the 99% wants and what is in the best interest of the 99% versus what is in the best interest of the individuals in the top 1% who extract money off of our vulnerabilities. They will invest massive sums of money in the various states against the federal government if the federal government tries to pass something like this, being against Medicare for all, but for incremental piecemeal changes to Obamacare. Their argument would be, hey, we have this Obamacare, we need to, work on enhancing and fixing the Obamacare, because they full well understand that their dominance and the strength of their industry diminishes if something like Medicare for all passes. Because understand, Medicare for all is not just Medicare for all. It's essentially eliminating the private healthcare industry in the United States and allowing people to have high quality health care. The overhead for Medicare, if I'm not mistaken, is like 2%, as opposed to a healthcare industry where they essentially make their additional profit off of us paying more for healthcare than we pay in anywhere else in the world. I was in other countries and I needed medication when I was in those countries. I don't have insurance in those countries, of course, because that's not where I live. And I was expecting to take a brutal hit when I'm paying for drugs. The amount that I was paying for drugs was essentially less than what I was paying for the United States with insurance. Put that in perspective. The amount that I'm paying for medication without insurance in those countries was in some cases less than what I was paying for in the United States with insurance. I'm just saying. We pay twice as much for our medical care in this country than they do in other countries. That's not because we get more medical care. That has everything to do with us paying just twice as much from the standpoint of their profits. Why do we want that? And why is that okay? Why is it okay that they can essentially rape us for massive amounts of profits and something that we're all vulnerable for? I think healthcare is somewhat of a different industry in regards to how we need to engage with dealing with this particular industry. So the answer is yes, it would be difficult to pass because the medical and healthcare industry will fight tooth and nail in order to maintain the system that we already have. Which means that buying politicians, that's my point. It's hard to pass because of the money that they get, investing it into the politicians and the political system would be in order to fight and stop Medicare for all from passing. Republicans are not going to go for it, which means that the question becomes, are Democrats going to go for it? I am honestly inclined to believe that under normal circumstances, Democrats are not even going to go for it. It will be a political fight. I strongly suspect that many of the Democrats who are saying they're for it now are only for it because they have no way of affecting it into legislation. And the moment that you get into the point where there's some level of Democratic majority, that the Democratic support will drain away. That there will be one amendment, one bill, one this, one that after the next in order to try to change, tweak, diminish, etc., etc., etc. That doesn't make it impossible. It just means it's difficult to pull off. And it also means that your political enemies in this are Democrats and Republicans because both parties will be against it. Hope that makes sense. All right, this one is funny. I have to read it. Jay Scott. Trump wants to give us a big, beautiful health care, but the deep state won't let him. Charles Piera. Tulsi just announced her presidency bid. No fucking way. Did she? All right, I have to check that out. I'm actually excited about that. I need to take a further look at the Tulsi Gabbard, but she stopped taking corporate donations, which gold star. She was against the conflict in Syria and took the presidency, the Trump administration, the task on that, gold star. She supported Sanders, even though Hillary Clinton was sending her dirty and nasty letters about that support for Sanders, gold star. Some of the policies from her supportive stuff that's going on in India gets a little dicey, but from the standpoint of domestic policy, foreign policy, I like her. Ralph Nader is saying shutting down the government is an impeachable offense. Laura Glenny. I've said that! I've said that. So the Trump and Russia stuff is nonsense. Even the paying off the porn star stuff to me is nonsense. That's them essentially trying to do their best to come up with some reason to attack the president on. I didn't like it when they were doing it under Obama. I don't like it when they're doing it under the Democratic Party. But shutting down the government just seems so extreme. Like, if your job as a president is order to, just kind of administration of the country, you're the CEO of the country in an odd way. Shutting it down over this seems extreme, and it seems problematic. I'm gonna have to check that out. Now, all we need is a competent Indian chief. Oh, the DNC has a primary. Bob Ramirez said, now all we need is a competent Indian chief, and the DNC has a primary. Oh, you don't want Kamala Harris. Oh, you don't want Kamala Harris. I don't want Kamala Harris. I'm excited about Tulsi's candidacy also, upstate Raider. Yeah, I am too. Alright. What if Bernie was a VP? Just thinking. I don't want Bernie to be a VP. What's happening, Trudy? I didn't see you were here. Boss, Bernie and Tulsi. Jay Scott, I might as well troll. Yeah, dude. I mean, when you make arguments that is just critical for the, I think I've even defended saying, well, no, he's not trolling in the sense of making decent arguments. That's not my issue. But I can look through most of these chats or most of these things, and they're just trolling. They're just comments just to be trolls. And to ignore that, because I don't necessarily think that adds anything to the discussion. I have people here who are Trump supporters who I massively disagree with on a lot of the stuff they say. Bob Ramirez. I don't think Bob is a troll. Bob disagrees with this line of conversation about Trump. I don't consider him trolling. I don't consider most of this stuff trolling. But let's be honest. I mean, for fuck's sake. I can look at these. I mean, stop trolling with sarcasm. Yeah. Jay Scott, stop trolling with sarcasm and just make rational arguments from time to time. Jeremy Chase, yes. I mean, I tend to ignore it because it's just a lot of stuff is trolling. Dax Jacobson, Trump should hand out free drugs from the... Trump should hand out free drugs from the wall? What? The courts will be involved if this shutdown continues. That's true. That I believe. Yes, Jay, I agree with you. I mean, Trump is talking about the shutdown for a year. The President of the United States has decided to essentially kill the United States government. Yes, there should be court challenges to what Trump is doing. And not just court challenges. I mean, look, the question becomes, how long is the Republican Party going to be content with having the government shut down in this way? And what political pressure could be brought to bear on the Republican Party for doing this? That's the question. At some point, Trump is going to have to do one or two things. Either declare a national emergency in order to try to get funding for the wall, in which case he's okay signing a bill for the government shutdown, allowing the government shutdown to end. Or somehow get Democrats to move from their position. Democrats aren't moving from their position. So then the question becomes, what are you going to do in order to end this? Because you're not going to allow this to go on, or you can't allow it to go on in perpetuity. If this is a game of chicken between Trump and the Democrats, Trump will lose. He keeps saying this. He has no reason to deviate from their position. I'd be surprised if Chuck Schumer doesn't cave on this, Balthazar. Disagree. In fact, I disagree with you so much, I can put money on this. That's how, certain is too strong. I just don't believe they're going to cave on this, Balthazar. I don't believe it. 1,000 times, I don't believe it. Like, what will be the incentive? If Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi at this point backs away from this, what would be the political effect from the standpoint of the members of the Democratic Party? Because you must understand, from the standpoint of Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, lefties, let's say the Justice Democrat version of the Democratic Party, meaning the base of the Democratic Party. You can say Justice Democrats and those types. I'm not a Democrat, and I don't consider people like Dord, some of these other people who are on the left, who aren't Democrats, even though they may engage in the political space from elements on the left because that's the fastest thing moving. So when I'm talking about the left, I'm talking about creatures of the Democratic Party. That's the politically abused spouse of the party. They are not on board for a dime for this wall. Centrists are not on board for a dime on this wall. Nobody in that party is on board for one dime for this wall. If Chuck Schumer does this, Chuck Schumer will be going against his own base and against even the centrists of the party itself. Like, he would have to repudiate the party itself. Nancy Pelosi, same thing. They would incur a certain wrath from a base that is not for this at all. That's why I don't necessarily believe that they're going to back away from it. Government is closed because we're out of money. That is a fact. Well, we're out of money because they are not appropriating money for the government. That's not, yes, a court can't force the government to borrow money. Oh, I see what you mean. Your argument is this is a political conversation, that the courts are not going to intervene on something that's a political argument. That may be true. I mean, the courts have been somewhat hesitant to kind of get into what they consider to be purely a legislative fight. And yet Chuck Schumer has already offered over $1 billion. Yes, but that $1 billion, in order to build that wall, it's going to cost, what, $30 million or some insane, $30 billion, some insane amount of money in order to build a wall. The $5 billion is only there as something that Trump can hold up and say, see, I got money to build this wall. Look at the $5 billion to build this wall. The reality of it is $5 billion is not going to go anywhere to build that wall. It is purely just a political concession that he wants. Chuck Schumer offering $1 billion is somewhat of a political concession. That's true, but it's a political concession that, like, it doesn't go anywhere. And that $1 billion is not for a wall, by the way. That $1 billion is for border security. The wall that Donald Trump is talking about building is not even a wall, it's a fence. And you can make an argument that a fence is a wall if you look at it in a particular way. But $1 billion is not going to cut it. And that $1 billion, I don't think, if I'm reading that correctly, is not for the wall. The point is to discourage Pelosi and Schumer. You want a reward them for your support. You have nowhere else to go. I don't want the reward. When, in the last, I forget what it was about, but Ralph Nader comes out and makes an argument that just so happened the Democratic Party was making. Ralph Nader is not a Democrat. But the point of the matter is, just because you agree with something that's taking place in objective reality, and somebody else just so happens agrees with you on it, doesn't necessarily mean you guys are working together in your agreement. It just means that both of you agree on the same thing. I hope that makes sense. Something happens in physical matter reality. Let's say a guy runs a red light. And I say, I think it's bad that that guy ran a red light, and we need to maybe do something in order to prevent people to put a red light. So maybe have cars that automatically stop during a red light. Maybe have something that comes up in order to prevent the car from moving past it. Let's create a technical solution in order to deal with the issue of people running red lights. This is dangerous, we need to fix it. A Democrat comes in and says, we need to do something about people running red lights, and we need to come up with a solution for people running red lights. Your argument is just because both of us standing side by side are saying that we, in physical matter reality, something needs to be done, that we are somehow working together, and by virtue of me saying I need to stop people from running red lights, that I am somehow helping the Democratic Party. This is utter nonsense. There are going to be things that take place in waking reality that we objectively can look at, and that I may think something should be done in order to fix a particular issue, and maybe a member of the Republican Party may think something needs to be done to fix a particular issue. It doesn't mean we're working in tandem just because we agree with something. I agree with Rand Paul that our foreign policy sucks, that we shouldn't be jumping from country to country, we shouldn't be drone bombing these places, and that in doing so, we essentially create the terrorists that we're trying to stop. Me doing so is not me supporting Rand Paul, it's me looking at an issue saying that this issue needs to be resolved, and the way we're going about resolving it is not disadvantageous. Your argument goes in line with the argument that Democrats make that say that if you're not on board with him, you're somehow supporting Trump. I think that argument is nonsense. I support or not support an issue based on how I regard that issue, not based on what a particular party is doing about it. I mean, come on, be fair. Be fair. I disagree with Trump on this. I think he's in the wrong way. Cal is a deluded, chink-like, condescending clown. Once he admitted taking over the sinking Titanic is a bad choice, we can start talking about solutions. Yeah, I mean, in their mind, they want to do something, and they believe that something is better than nothing, in which case, in their mind, taking over the Democratic Party is the way to go. I'm skeptical. I mean, I feel it. I'm skeptical. I don't think they're taking over anything, at least not the way it looks at this moment. You underestimate the power of Nancy Kiss the Ring Pelosi creative experiments. I like Cal, but I hate that he likes TYT. I like Cal to look. I think you can be like people and be relatively close to people, even if you don't necessarily agree with their politics per se. I like AJ Goodman, and people look at me like, "How can you like AJ Goodman? How can you like AJ Goodman?" My wife doesn't even particularly like AJ Goodman, even though I completely disagree with his politics. Like you can do both. I mean, I don't think you have to hate people just because they're you have political disagreements. I'll give you another one. I think Sam Cedars a condescending asshole, but Sam Cedar was one of those shows that was part of my political awareness. Tom Hartman, same thing. One of those shows part of my political awareness. That said, both are sheepdogs. One is a complete condescending asshole. Tom Hartman is brilliant, especially from a historical standpoint. By the same token, if you watching his show, Tom Hartman was sheepdog like nobody's business, even when he gets the points that he's tying himself in knots on. Tom Hartman, when he came out about the Syrian thing, where Trump said he's pulling troops out of Syria, Tom Hartman comes out, does a show. Tom Hartman was against us going into Syria. He wasn't necessarily on board for this. He's tend to be anti-war. But even in this, he got his talking points, and he's attacking Trump for pulling troops out of Syria while tying himself into a knot to get across that he's not pro-war, but he doesn't believe that we should be taking our troops out of Syria, even though he, betrayed himself by kind of making the point in the middle of him doing that of, even though, I don't believe we should be in there, we shouldn't be taking our troops out. It's amazing. It's amazing. Snort, yes, 35 for VP or Speaker of the House, third in line for President. Cal, like a liberal Jordan Peterson, he's having an intellectual theoretical debates about real life shit, so they'll never be able to understand it from a real life perspective. I don't know. Hartman is a fucking encyclopedia. Tom Hartman is a fucking encyclopedia. He is. I'm not waiting on Cal. He's going to figure out in 2038 that Justice Democrats aren't going to fix the party. Here's the thing. I'm going to defend Cal on this. There is some level of historical precedent for what Cal is saying. I mean, why do you have the level of Democrats that you have today? It wasn't always that way. I mean, you had at one point a Democratic Party that was decidedly to the left, that was anti-Wall Street. They may have never been necessarily anti-war, even though you had a period in American policy where we were anti-interventionists. Things change. I mean, I'm not in this attitude that things never change and that things aren't possible. I don't particularly know. If you're looking for precedent, though, there was precedent. I mean, if you were living back in the 1920s, you could make the argument that none of the political parties are going to represent the interests of the poor and the middle class in the country of the United States. You could make the argument that the political parties are not going to do anything about the top 1% and the greed of the 1%. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was somewhat of a change on that and went after, granted, he was a Republican, but went after this kind of class of the 1%. They believed that they were above the law, and he was making the point you are not above the law. Same thing with FDR, same thing even to some degree with Truman and the people who followed Truman. Even LBJ, from the domestic standpoint, wanted to accomplish certain things that he wasn't necessarily able to accomplish because of the war efforts. I guess I'm making the point that there have been times where the party systems changed. So let's be fair to Cal. He's not completely wrong that there's an impossibility here of changing that. You can make an argument that when Bill Clinton came into effect, and maybe even during the Jimmy Carter time, that there was a change in the politics of the Democratic Party where they decided to take tons of cash and eschew this idea of labor and unions. That was the change. So it's not impossible. It's not impossible. The question becomes, and it's somewhat of a practical question, about third parties. Now, if you make the argument that if all of these guys just gave themselves over to a third party, then we could get this show on the road and we could start doing something for change. Agreed. But are all of these guys going to do that? They need to expend all of the potential within the Democratic Party before they decide that there's something else. The question becomes, if you continuously fail, at which point do you say there's nothing that can get done within the party itself, and trying to function in the party brings you into an almost unmanageable factor within the political discourse? That the very act of trying to function within the Democratic Party somehow brings you into alignment with sheepdogging people into something that is not really going to represent their interests from the standpoint of leadership. It's an interesting back and forth, but I think there's an argument to be had here. If everyone put all of their effort into Justice Democrats went third party instead, would they have gotten zero into Congress or about the same? Third parties are hard, man. I feel you. Third parties are rough. The point we are at now is 10 years to extinction, no time for third parties to grow. Yeah, but also does it mean that from the standpoint of the Democratic Party, do you believe that in that short period of time, the Democratic Party is going to change? Do you think they're going to change? AOC is already dulling Wall Street. I think you're talking about the Green New Deal. That's a whole video in and of itself, Bob. Mrs. Tree, others have told me that in the past, hanging up on callers when he did like what they had to say, he had no argument. Okay, I missed one. Don't take too much weight in BS talking. Okay? You don't have to win 50% of Democrats to steer the political discourse. That's true. You only need enough that neither party, simple majority, nor the forced coalition can. That's true. That I agree with you on. You're making my argument. This idea that you don't need to be able to win, you just need to make them lose. If that makes sense. Like, I don't need to get a majority as a third party in order to force concessions into the other party. If my goal is to get things accomplished, just being able to pull people out of the political discourse from the standpoint of the other two parties forces one of those parties to change course in order to appropriate some of the voters into my political system. Meaning, trying to sheepdog people into the Democratic Party allows the Democratic Party to essentially not do what you want them to do, as opposed to a real threat to the party ever being able to win is pulling them out of the two-party system and into a third party that has more, let's say, agency to try to affect their political will. The Green New Deal that they're talking about from Ocasio-Cortez was appropriated from the Green Party. That Green New Deal that was appropriated from the Green Party takes the language of what the Green Party was trying to do without necessarily taking the policies that the Green Party was espousing. That said, it's still an appropriation from a third party. I think this is what you're talking about, Baltazar. All right. I'm going to end this. This has gone over an hour, and I got to be honest. I thought this video was going to be all of 10 minutes. Guys, I want to thank you all for the support for the show. Oh, here's clicking. Hey Jamal, I've noticed recently you've been clicking to swap scenes. The problem is that your mouse is being picked up by the mic. I can either do a tutorial on cardinal mode for you, or second, you clip to desk mic and pop filter. Thoughts? That's a good point. I noticed that in the videos, though. What I can do is I can start. No, I just read your Streamlabs one. Bell, I just read your Streamlabs. keep in mind, I don't see your Streamlabs doesn't always alert me when something's passed, even after configuring Streamlabs. Sometimes the configurations fall apart where you have to go in and redo it in order for it to do it again. But no, I see it. It's right here. I've noticed that you've recently been clicking to swap scenes. The problem is that your mouse is being picked up with your mic. So there are two things. I do have another mic that I could be using. Let me think about that. Let me think about that one. Make a ninja mouse and remove the internal click plastic tag. Well, that's interesting. That's interesting. My bad, just slight delay. Yeah, there was like a 2-second delay between something that I say and do versus when it shows. What I can do is I can get rid of the click that's on the mouse. I think I can do that. I think so. All right, let me end this. Is this a first world problem? Yeah, that's a first world problem. Yeah. Right here. Rob, Illinois. I hate the Democratic Party just as much as any real lefty, yes. However, we have 12 years to get our shit in order. You want a third party to address climate change. What's your 12-year plan? That is the tough one. Like, that's the tough question, right? That's the fucking tough one to, Rob, I think the catch is so he clicks, big deal. Roughly, yeah, I don't think the clicks are a big deal, but everybody have their own subjective standard on that stuff. There was one of the things that the people were doing, I forget the name of the bags, I think it was Sun Chips. Sun Chips had a bag, and they were trying to be environmental friendly, and so with the Sun Chips bag, they changed the configuration of the materials in the bag in order to make them essentially biodegradable. This worked in Canada, but people in the United States complained that the bag was too loud, meaning opening the bag essentially was too loud of a thing, and because it was too loud of a thing, people wanted them to change it. Fuck that environment. I want this bag to be able to open up as silently as possible. My wife, I've been having trouble sleeping at night. My sleep schedule has been out of whack since I've gotten back. And that tends to lead me to like 6 to 7 in the morning finally being able to nod off. It's fucking insane. But that also means that when I finally come in to lay to bed, I'm awake all night when I come in, and if I come in to lay in bed. And that's me like eating or something, and I'm like opening a bag of chips, or I'm opening something, and she's like, what the fuck are you doing? What the fuck are you doing? So yeah. Trudy, Rob, Illinois, exactly, no time to waste. What is the plan, candidate? So let me make an argument. And I'll put forth my argument to you. You can agree or disagree with this argument like any other argument that I made. It's like this is the beginning of the song. What is your 12-year plan? The same question could be asked of you. What is your 12-year plan? I think a lot of the plans from lefties are get Bernie Sanders as president. What if you don't get Bernie Sanders as president? Like, I guess I'm saying all of this stuff is being hefted on the idea of a populist or a lefty getting in the office trying to transform American society based on what's taking place at the head of the office. With Donald Trump in the office, you can see to some degree the limits at the same token of powers that are invested in that office when somebody wants to actually get something accomplished. That said, power is not necessarily, it doesn't need to be direct. Like, your ability to get something accomplished doesn't necessarily need to be, I am putting X or Y in that office. Look at the Yellow Vests. The Yellow Vests have started to put pressure on the political system to such a degree where Macron gets in and starts giving political concessions because they're shutting France down. Macron has taken this major step of instituting what's almost considered to be a fascism law or totalitarian law, where they're trying to stop people from protesting and stop people from wearing yellow vests in those protests. It's pretty amazing and belligerent in what he's trying to put forward. I guess my point is this. Sheepdogging is not necessarily the way to go to get your affairs in order. there needs to be some coordination between the political edifice and the people who are on the ground who are pushing for certain changes. But there doesn't necessarily need to be a direct sheepdog. My system's going in and out. My signal's going in and out. It doesn't have to be direct. And to be honest, to be too direct, where you're too willing to essentially back up whatever political party is in office, is going to just be a propping up of a system that is already in place that you have, reviled and have gone against. I guess my point is, it's not as extreme as third party. What the same token is not as extreme as sheepdogging. I think it's somewhere in between. Pulling people out of the political system gets across that people are serious, that they're not willing to support political parties as they stand. If that means focusing on the Democratic Party because you think there's more leeway in that party, then allowing people to just automatic sheepdog into that party doesn't necessarily get what you want, especially if you're not extracting clear and concise political concessions for people going into that party. If the Democratic Party came out and said, if you put us in office, we're going to pass Medicare for all, period. That's something clear, straightforward, that you can hold against them or hold for them, and then it becomes, do you believe that they're going to do it? None of that has happened. The leadership, from the standpoint of Nancy Pelosi, is not for Medicare for all. They're not for expanding Social Security. They're not for extending medical benefits or education benefits. They're not for any of that stuff. So putting them in office doesn't necessarily get you from where you want to get to when the leadership of the party is not on board for doing so. If 15 million people pull themselves out of the Democratic Party would know that those people are serious. And that party would either cease to exist or start to appropriate some of those policy positions that those people want. It takes numbers, and to some degree it takes numbers with a threat of them losing. It takes the threat of losses. I just don't think it's as simple as you should support the Democratic Party because you have 12 years left to live and the third party is not going to be able to be constructed in that time frame. I think it's more along the lines of you need to suck support away from that Democratic Party from an organized people who are serious about not being willing to support people who aren't representing their interests. Meaning, you are not getting our vote if you're not towing along a particular line, and be very clear on what those lines are and what you're willing to sign on to in order to get your vote. I don't think it's as clear as just supporting these guys. I think it's somewhere in between. 10 to 12 years to the ecological nightmare kind of puts all the other arguments in the context. Yeah, it does. It does. But the Democratic Party is not on board for any climate change legislation that deals with the fact that there's 10 to 12 years left. So supporting them doesn't get you anywhere. It doesn't get you anywhere. Just saying. Just saying. Democrats would rather lose to Republicans than win with progressives, Jimmy Dore. I think to some degree that's true. It's kind of like the Blairites in the UK. Like if one of the main arguments of the Democratic Party is a lefty can't get elected. Like, if that's their thing. I love that name. God damn it, I want to keep calling you Jesus. It's Jesus. I know it's Jesus. I just want to keep calling you Jesus. Fuck it, I'm calling you Jesus. If your main argument, if one of the key thesis of the proposal that you put forth is we're centrists and we're the only ones that can get elected, and you lefties have to be content with tiny little incremental changes around the edges while we stay completely obsequious to corporate interests and the money class. Because you can't get elected. We'd want to do more stuff, but you can't get elected doing that stuff. If that's the central thesis of that argument, and that argument proves itself to be false because lefties are getting elected, and not just getting elected, are putting forth actual policies that centrists said were impossible, it shows them to be a lie. It shows the entire pretext of their existence to be somewhat on false grounds. And you start asking the questions, why do you need that guy if this other guy here is a better and full-throated representation of the left? Their existence comes into question the moment that something moves to the left of them. I mean, understand, at this point, you had all of these other groups, communists, socialists, even unions, decimated, and for the most part destroyed, and the far side of the left was representative of just the Democratic Party. There was no one to the left of the Democratic Party. It was just the Democratic Party. If that is proven to be untrue, and if you find that that's somewhat of a lie, the existence of the party itself, at least from the standpoint of the neo-libs and the third-way Democrats, comes into complete and utter question. The reason that they may be more okay with Republican winning as opposed to progressives is because a Republican winning keeps them intact, as opposed to a progressive brings into question their entire existence. That's the way I see it. Older voters will not vote third party, and Trump wins. Trudy, I don't know. So I break this up into 2 points. We're talking, like, one talking about the president from third party, and the other one talking about Congress. So breaking them into 2 things. Sanders is not going to run as a third party. Tulsi is not going to run as a third party. I don't know who would run as a third party that would gain support and momentum to overturn the two-party system from the standpoint of presidents. So, fair enough. Sanders runs as a Democrat. He's getting my vote. I don't care. He's running as a Democrat. If Tulsi runs as a Democrat, I need to look further into her record, but up to this point, I like her. So, them being a Democrat doesn't tar them enough for me to not vote for them as a Democrat. When you get to congressional candidates, I think that's different, Trudy, because the goal in this is not just one person in an entire branch. The goal in this is to affect your political will on the political apparatus itself as a whole, meaning draining support away from the two-party system in that way has more clout as opposed to a president that's almost representative of one branch, meaning it's one guy with the veto power as an entire executive branch, as opposed to 435 members within the House of Representatives and 100 in the Senate. Meaning there's more people, 535 members of Congress in that sense, meaning letting some lose is perfectly on the agenda, and I would even say completely necessary. Third parties are an essential part of our country. In some cases, they need to be supported. It just depends. Andrew Yang could be a third party. Nobody knows who Andrew Yang is. Just saying. I'm just talking about the presidential march. Fair enough. I vote third party ticket every chance I get. Fair enough. I noticed Julian Assange was observing a unity for Julian Assange tonight, Jamal. Love to have you all. Love to you all. No way. Julian Assange was observed in the unity for Assange tonight. No way. I didn't know that. Yes, I caught you live on Friday night. Hello, Draw. What's happening, Moni? Now, Moni, I'm in an hour and 30 minutes, and I was going to end this. So I may. Those old people seeing the same crap over and over. Yeah, that part is true. Moni, I was about to end this, but I have a few more that I wanted to do tonight. I didn't know this one was going to go this long, but I ended up talking to my audience. Don Joe, those old people seeing the same crap over and over again. Yes. And this is me getting old. There's a line in Steely Dan. She thinks I'm crazy, but I'm just growing old. I love that line. It's in a Hey 19 thing where he's like, hey 19, that's Aretha Franklin. She doesn't remember the Queen of Soul. She don't know the Queen of Soul. I remember these kids talking about McCartney. I think it was called Paul McCartney. And they were saying Kanye West has put Paul McCartney on the map. And it's like, what? Like, you're children. You don't know what's taking place even in musical history. But Steely Dan, that's Aretha Franklin. She don't remember the Queen of Soul. And there's this awesome line. She thinks I'm crazy, but I'm just growing old. As you get older, you see it's like a recycling of stuff. When you're 19 years old, you don't necessarily see the recycling because you don't necessarily know the historical precedent. But by the time you get 60 and 70, you see the same things being recycled. Yeah, different packaging, but the theme of it is pretty much the same. Don Joe, you're right. You're right. All right, let me end this. Paul was making music when Kanye was sperm. You see Ocasio-Cortez quoting the Watchmen. Yes, I have a video on that. I do have a video on that coming up. I saw that. And honestly, one of my favorite lines of the Watchmen. Rorschach was one of my favorite people in the Watchmen. And there's this line where he's talking about, like, you know, the politicians and the whores or something, with a cess, you know, gather up around their heads and they scream, "Save us!" And with a whisper, I say no. I love that line. But Ocasio makes this quote of, you know, "I'm not in here with you, you're in here with me." And she's quoting this because the Democrats are unhappy with her. They don't like the fact that she's saying that some of them should be primary. They don't like the attention that she's getting. Some of them are jealous of the attention that she's getting. And they feel it's undeserved. They don't like her attacking other Democrats. I love it. I love The Watchmen. The Watchmen is one of my favorite movies. I love that film. Scott Pilgrim is another one. Scott Pilgrim is more of a guilty pleasure. But Watchmen is one of my favorite films. Cloud Atlas, one of my favorite films. This is fucking awesome. Are you doing more videos tonight, Upstate Radio? Yes, I am doing more videos tonight. So, let me end this now. This one has gone an hour and 30 minutes. I'm going to have to cut some of this because this has gone way into fuckery. But I'll end it here. If you guys enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support through PayPal or Patreon. Let me make sure there's nothing on... Okay, let's make sure there's nothing on Streamlabs. Alright, guys. I will be back probably in 10-15 minutes. The book is better. I heard the book was better. I keep hearing that. I mean, keep in mind, the other one is, 3 hours long? The movie was like 3 hours long. And there was more stuff in the book. They had to actually break the book up. Otherwise, you know, they weren't going to get all in. LW. Thanks, Jamal. Oh, thank you, LW. I don't understand the thank yous. If I'm being honest, I do a stream, I do a show, I enjoy doing the show. I appreciate, and of course, need your support in order to help me do the show. I'm always enamored by the thank yous, that's all. But thank you for allowing me to do the show. Let me say it that way. Alright, guys. I'll be about 10-15 minutes, but I'll be back in a few. Can't watch HBO no more because it's oh, John Oliver. Alright, guys. Just appreciate people speaking the truth. Oh, fair enough. I'll take that. At least the truth is so far as I can see it. There is no absolute truth per se. I can't say that's true. There are some things that are true. To say there's no absolute truth, they would say there's no absolute reality. Like, I do think there's objective reality per se. Like, I don't buy into this thing that is all purely perceptuals. I do. Yeah, I don't know if there's an absolute truth. I do know that what people see is usually just their perceptions of things. Like, if I'm sitting in a room with my mom and and I are having a conversation, I have an idea of what my mom is in my head, but that's not necessarily my mom. My mom is something outside of myself, ideally. And in being something outside of myself, what she is, you can make an argument that she doesn't even know the totality of what she is. She's taking on an identity that she wants to support. But what she is what she thinks she is different than any conception that I'm going to have in my head of who she is. And I would never be able to really communicate who she is, at least what I think she is, any more than she can communicate in totality of who she thinks she is. What my wife sees of my mom is going to be something different also. You're going to have three people in a room, all with different conceptions of one individual. Is there a truth in it? I don't think the truth is had in the individuals. I think there may be a truth in the absolute reality itself. Yeah, that's a tough one, man. Truth is a tough one. All right, let me end this here. If you guys enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support the PayPal or Patreon. Thanks all. I see you in a few.